This morning we're going to be looking at John chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. John chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. This passage is going to very much kind of feel like Easter, even though Easter already passed, because this is an event that takes right before Jesus is tried before the Jewish leaders and Pontius Pilate and crucified. But I think there's something that's very pragmatic, very practical for us that we can learn from this that applies to our daily life. So I want to read John 18, verses 1 through 11 to you. And then I want to draw out a few things that I think will be very relevant to our day-to-day lives. John chapter 18, beginning with verse 1. Just a quick setting. We talked about how Jesus was praying for the disciples before he left this world, before he went back to be with God the Father. And he prayed for the disciples that they would genuinely know God, that they would genuinely know Jesus, that they would genuinely know God's love. And then afterwards, this is where Jesus is going to shortly be taken away and tried. When Jesus had spoken these words, and that's talking about the prayers, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. To Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. And then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Who do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word he had spoken. "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" I don't know about you guys. Maybe you're used to the Bible having kind of strange stories contained within it. But this is a very strange kind of story. Something that maybe most of us will never experience. It's not a very normal kind of thing that occurs, right? I mean, swords are drawn, someone's ear is cut off, and we know from other Gospels that Jesus picks off this ear, picks it off the ground, and attaches it back to the servant, and he's miraculously healed. And so we know all these things. We know that the other disciples from the Gospel of Luke had swords as well. The disciples were armed. I don't know, is that pro-gun, anti-gun? It's not what we're getting at, but the disciples were armed. They were ready to go to war. They were ready to go and sword fight on behalf of Jesus. This is the scenario that we have. And so you might say, well, how is this passage kind of relevant to our normal day-to-day living? Well, I think the way that this applies to us is this, that all of us are going to experience relational stress difficulties. Anything from just people rubbing you the wrong way, to people stabbing you in the back, to people taking advantage of you, to people outright lying and getting a whole faction of people at work or in your family or among your friends against you, to turn against you, for to places where the people that you cared about the most, that you trusted the most, actually betray your trust. So this little passage is about this kind of place where all of this is brought together. You kind of wonder, why didn't they take Jesus in the daytime? Why didn't they just take Jesus? I don't think he would have put much of a fight, but why do they do it in the dark of night? Why do they do it with this whole group of men? And if you read the passage carefully, it says that Judas, he procures a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. A band here is actually the word legion, and most scholars, and myself included, doubt that there were 500 soldiers, Roman soldiers, because that would have been way too exorbitant and expensive, but probably a portion of the Roman legionnaires are here from one legion. And so maybe 50. And then some officers from the Jewish policemen, their own internal policemen that they could have had. I don't know, the Vatican Guard, if you will, something like that. And so maybe 50, 60 men. More than enough to overcome, especially with the Roman soldiers, to overcome 12 men, 11 who had swords, and Jesus who was unarmed. More than enough. Trained soldiers versus and policemen guard versus fishermen, tax collectors, etc. More than enough. You understand the situation? But here what we find is that we find the way that the world deals with, and the way that sometimes we are taught to deal with things that we don't like, or feel like when we're being attacked, how do we respond? Now you may think of Judas as the ultimate betrayer, but I think Judas felt betrayed by Jesus and the disciples as well. Let me explain that a little bit. It was a betrayal that he felt from his own self-deception. See, when he joined the disciples with Jesus, what he was thinking is, here's my shortcut, here's my avenue. But after listening to Jesus and being amazed and very impressed by him and his pitch and his vision and his just, his sermons and just his very presence and all the miracles that he's doing, if I join his band, and he called me to join his band, if I join his band of disciples, then man, I'm going to be on the fast track to everything that I've ever wanted. Wealth, power, fame, all the things that I desired. I don't know what Judas's life was like. Maybe he had a hard upbringing. Maybe he was raised in poverty. Maybe he was, abused in some way. I don't know. But in his mind, in his kind of twisted, sinful thinking, he thought, if I had enough wealth, and that's why he was the treasurer of the disciples, and he used it for his own all the time. That's what the Gospels say. If I get enough power, then I'll finally be satisfied. And Jesus is my ticket to get there. But then Jesus, who starts out with all these throngs, all these crowds, coming after him, instead of taking the power, instead of taking the wealth. It's like if you join some startup company and it's going to go IPO, it's going to go all this way. And instead of the CEO taking it that way and making all of you wealthy, he goes, no, I want to keep the product small and I want to keep it homey and let's just keep going the way that we are, and that's better. My thought of what's really valuable is not so much money or becoming some public huge company and losing our heart and soul, but rather we want to stay small. We won't make money, but you guys will love it, right? We'll be artists. We'll be amazing. And some of us are attracted by that, but Judas didn't want that at all. He didn't like how Jesus, it seemed to him, was changing the game, was changing the outcome. And so it's interesting. What he does, he finds another company, if you will, and stages a takeover, if you will, except that he ends up regretting it. He's so upset, I believe, that he desires, well, if I'm not going to get what I want, then all these other guys, I'm going to just take them down. At least I'll get a little bit of money out of it. Basically, he sells them out because he feels that he was betrayed. In a twisted way, most people in this world who betray others have a reason. They excuse themselves saying, well, that person betrayed me too first. They didn't do what I thought they were. They didn't do what I wanted them to do. There's some reason. If you look at all these crazy things that are going on in our schools with all the mass shootings and killings and stuff, if you go and talk with some of these kids that are, and people that are just kind of messed up, they'll say like, well, I have a reason why I did what I did. Because I was outcast, because people made fun of me, because people did these things, because people looked down upon me. They shouldn't have treated me like that. You see what I'm getting at? And so some ways and some twisted ways. And this is something that we have to be very aware of, that it's going to happen to us. Whether or not we do anything wrong to someone, it's going to be perceived. And even when you do exactly what is right, like Jesus does what's right, what's holy, what's proper in the eyes of God, he's going to be proud. And you too will be having those kinds of experiences. But the point I want to make here is then, how are we going to respond? Well, the way that the world would respond is kind of the way that Peter responds. He takes out a sword and he attacks and defends. And it's the reaction of all of us. We get defensive. But notice something about Jesus. He does something radically different. When they come, he knows what's going to happen. And he asks them a question. He says, who do you seek? Who are you looking for? Who have you come for? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, think about this. If they have torches and they have all these things, and they're with Judas, Judas obviously can point him out. But he's not at the forefront. He's with the crowd. He finds strength in being with the crowd. He doesn't want to stick out. He wants to rile up everybody else, get all that faction, all that stuff going on. But Jesus, what he does is he confronts it head on and says, so who are you after? What are you guys here to do? So we're here to get Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, okay, that's me. It's interesting here because as soon as he says that, in verse 6, it says, they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, I don't think this is some kind of miraculous thing. I think this is a very human thing. Because of the bearing, the authority, the confidence, they didn't expect Jesus to come out and say, hey, that's me. And so when they're kind of like taken aback for a second, they bump up into the people behind them, and maybe that's why they fell down. I don't know. Maybe there's some supernatural things. It's Jesus, regardless. But the point I'm trying to make here is what's really fascinating to me here is how Jesus responds. And he says, I'm the one that you want. Okay, take me. And he doesn't rile up his disciples. He doesn't create another. He doesn't cause a schism. He doesn't go into battle. He doesn't fight fire with fire. I want to say something that I want to, because I'm not going to be able to develop it very deeply, but I just want to say something very simply that I want you to know as Christians. As Christians, when we're defending our faith and when we're defending the church and defending Christ and defending what we believe in, we are never to use any kind of violence or force or coercion. I absolutely believe that. The Crusades that we all have read about in our history books was never God's will. Never. We are never, ever to evangelize someone who says, hey, if you will come and study underneath Christianity and learn about the faith and stuff like that, then we'll feed you, then we'll give you. It's never been a bargaining thing like that. That's never the way that is. And we're never to defend Christianity by force. Now, having said that, as Christians, I believe the Bible still allows us, though, to fight for what is right, to fight evil. For example, if you're a Christian and you became a soldier and you're going to fight, I know at that point it's not about you deciding whether something's just or right, but you go because you're defending the country or you're doing. I believe that God understands and allows you to do that. I really do. If someone comes into your house and is threatening your child or your family, I believe you have a right to defend with force your family. It's something of a little bit different thing. I know there's some gray areas there, and I don't want to go wholly into it, but what Jesus is talking about more than anything else is, but as Christians, our faith and what we believe in, those things, we speak it out. We defend it with verbal arguments, but we don't force. We don't do it with violence. It's never. Jesus never desired that. That's why we have within Christendom something that's called martyrdom, and maybe it's in other religions and other places, but where Christians die rather than fight against those that are persecuted. That's a tough one. It really, really is. Now, if you can avoid it, if you can run away, I don't think God says don't do that. Of course not. Don't just stand there and get slaughtered. But at that point, when you have a chance, then do you fight back? No, you run away. That's what the Bible says. And God will take care of that. A number of years ago, when I was younger, one of my friends was serving at a large church as the missions pastor. Really educated, really smart guy. Another guy came within the church, and he was another pastor. pastor. And what we kind of noticed about him, I mean, he seemed nice enough, but he was super ambitious. And so he came into this very large church, and he didn't have a position because he tried getting a position. He applied for whatever open positions there were at this church. I just wanted to be at this large church. He never quite made the cut. But he just came to the church and started worshiping, became a congregant, and he kind of like schmoozed up the leaders and the people up ahead, and just was very diligent, worked really hard. And I thought, oh, that's good, dude. And eventually, when a position opened up, he got it. So he just went to the church and just served. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's good initiative and everything like that. He became a part-time pastor of the education department. Shortly thereafter, my friend had been there at the church for a long time, and so that church gave sabbaticals, and so for a year he was on a sabbatical, and he was visiting missionaries and people that they were supporting in different countries, and so he was taking his time and just really renewing himself, getting a new vision for the church's mission program and whatnot, and visiting these various missionaries. But during that time, they needed someone to kind of fill in some of the administrative roles, and so this guy volunteered to do it. And during the 1 year when he was doing it, he just lobbied and just schmoozed, whatever you want to call it, and eventually, somehow, and my friend was surprised, but when he got back, this guy had taken his position. For me, the bigger shock is that the leadership had done that. So when he came back, they said, you know what? They didn't fire him or anything. They said, oh, this guy's been doing a really good job, and so we thought maybe it's time for a change. So we're going to let him have your position, and we want you to go and do some other stuff within the church. That's really like, if you have a job and you have a certain job and you go away for a vacation, you come back and now your job is given to someone else, and now you have a different job that they want you to do. And so my friend talked to some of the folks, and I remember talking with him. I was like, what in the world? This is crazy. And, he had been very helpful to this guy and all these things, and just felt really stabbed in the back. And also betrayed by the leadership of the church. They didn't say anything until he came back. Really weird scenario. But it happens, even within the church. And after praying about it, he just went with it. He made his case and said, well, I'd rather do the mission stuff, but okay, if that's the decision of the church. And then shortly thereafter, he got offered a teaching post at a seminary, and so he went to go do that full time, and then help with the church part time, and eventually kind of phased out. It happens within the church. But what was interesting is that within, about a year and a half or so, this guy that had kind of wormed his way into this position suddenly resigned for greener pastures, another church, a bigger church, a better position. And he was just gone. And then, I don't know a lot about him, but we know from kind of the chaos that he created, and just, circles are not that big. Every 2-3 years, one place. And I was just amazed that people kept hiring him, but eventually that's what his desire was. And the church that had gone through all of this invited my friend back to come and be the missions pastor. And eventually, he ended up doing both, but it's fascinating to me. He could have stood his ground and created a faction, because there were some leaders at the time in the church that said, no, wait, what's going on? This is not right. And they could have had an infight within the church, and could have maybe even split the church, but instead he moved out. And I think what happened is that the church learned a valuable lesson. Some of those leadership learned a valuable lesson. The guy's true colors kind of showed up. And my friend, at the end, was more honored and more. I don't think that's why he did it, but in a sense, he did it in the right way. I'm not saying everything's going to have a happy ending or a simple ending. It was incredibly painful for he and his wife, because this was their home church. This was a church that they had all these relationships, and they just felt like the whole church turned their back. It's going to happen to all of us at some point in some way. I'm not just trying to preach doom and gloom, but that's the reality of it. But in that scenario, what are you going to do? Jesus experiences it, and what does he do? He trusts that God will work it all out. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. But that's the response that we're supposed to have. On the flip side of the coin, it doesn't say too much about this, but it's really interesting because Peter responds the way that we ought not to respond when we're betrayed, hurt, or taken advantage of. Now, I know you guys don't carry swords around, and I know you don't go around lopping off people's ears. But in a sense, that's Peter's human emotion boiling over into a bad human decision and action. Do you guys get what I'm saying? Even the quietest of us at points probably, we've fantasized or thought about how we're going to respond, or we've maybe said things in anger or at the heat of the moment, or done things at the heat of the moment that we regret that we would normally never do, but all the things that are piled up on us, and all of a sudden we explode. I don't know why Peter went after Malchus, the high priest's servant, instead of Judas, but somehow, I don't know, maybe they were standing next to each other, I don't know. But can you imagine Peter probably thinking in his mind, man, I knew this guy was bad news all along, and now he's done this, and, all those things that we were suspecting him about, and you get so mad, and you're like, And maybe he's even frustrated at Jesus because Jesus is seemingly so passive in this. We know from the other Gospels that the other disciples had swords. We also know from the other Gospels that they even asked Jesus, what should we do? What should we do? And Luke 22, Jesus' disciples asked him, Lord, should we strike with our swords? They said, should we go fight them, even though we're outnumbered? And then before Jesus answers, Peter strikes off the ear. And in Luke 22, Luke is really nice to Peter. It didn't say Peter draws his swords and strikes off the ear. He says, one of them struck off the servant. By this time, Peter was the head of the church, the new church when Luke was written, and so I knew that was part of it. But how do we respond like Jesus and not like Peter at those times of betrayal? And sometimes it's not even betrayal. Maybe it's just a difficult time that you go through. Or when something very painful happens in your life. When you feel maybe betrayed by God. God, where were you? God, why weren't you watching over me? Earlier this week, we got a message from one of my college friends. He's at the emergency room because his wife had this continual cough. And she's actually a trained doctor. She's retired somewhat now. But she's having this continual cough. So they went to the emergency room and they diagnosed her with pneumonia. And said, oh, okay, it's severe. We need to hook you up with an IV. And all of a sudden, 50-somewhat-year-old woman, and all this stuff that's going on. Usually very, very healthy, both of them very healthy. And then he sent out another message. Well, they diagnosed her with ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome. Basically, it means you have pneumonia and it's flaring up, and all our penicillin, all our medicines aren't knocking it out, and it's just going worse. And so they induce a coma, so you're not in as much distress because you're bleeding, and they put a tube, an intubator, all that stuff, and you're kept on life support basically, and then they try to fight all the infection with all their cocktails of medicines. And this struck home to me because this is how my father passed away. He got a cold when he was in Korea, and then he got pneumonia, and then he was in the hospital, diagnosed with ARDS, in an induced coma for about a month before he eventually passed away. So I was a little bit worried, but she was much younger, so much healthier. So he asked us to pray. I was praying throughout this week. And then a couple of nights ago, he sent another message saying that her heart had failed. And resuscitated her, and she was not getting better. So he'd been in the hospital for about 3 days with that. Just the other day, he called, he sent out another message like so sudden. She's coughing, we're going to the ER, pray for us. She passed away. And I was kind of in shock. And then he said, I said, I don't know why this is happening, but heaven came to me. I trust God, comfort all of us. And he actually was comforting the rest of us that were so kind of like feeling bad for him. So what happens when pain, betrayal, emotional pain, physical pain, death happens? I think C.S. Lewis said something very interesting that I want you to kind of remember. And here's what he says about pain, maybe betrayal, hurts. Pain in itself, hurt in itself is not good. What is good in any painful experience is that for the sufferer, his submission to the will of God, you learn to say, I trust you, God, I submit to you. And for the spectators, that's who we were with my friend, the compassion aroused and the acts of mercy to which it leads. Let me read that again. Pain in itself is not good. What is good in any painful experience is for the sufferer his submission to the will of God, and for the spectators the compassion aroused and the acts of mercy to which it leads. In other words, what C.S. Lewis is saying is, as Christians, the way that we respond and react to painful things in our life, betrayal, illness, death, that is going to, in us, develop and mature our faith in God, but also it'll affect all those that are watching us and either draw us towards God and pull out something in their own hearts that connects to God. I want to just point out a couple of things that we can do to respond the way that Jesus does, not the way that Peter does. If you know from the Gospels, what was Jesus and the disciples, Peter included, doing in the Garden of Gethsemane, across the brook Kidron? He was praying. And he says, Lord, if this cup can be taken away from me. And he was in anguish and turmoil. What were the disciples doing? They were prayer sleeping. They were trying to pray and then falling asleep. And he came back to them and said, can't you stay up now and pray with me? And then he went away again to pray and then he fell asleep. When we're not active, awake, and actively pursuing God, then we're more asleep and we're more susceptible to responding to the world. It's not just about prayer, but it's about actively pursuing God. And this is why it's so important for us to continually remind ourselves every morning as we wake up, God, I want to know you. I want to delight you. And just to keep that in our minds, in the forefront of our minds, to read the Word of God, to pray, whatever helps you to do that. And then the second thing that happens is that we need to practice obeying the Word of God, because sometimes we read the Word of God, sometimes we hear the Word of God, sometimes we hear God speaking to our hearts, but it doesn't make sense, it's not something we want to do. And the more that we learn how to do what doesn't make sense, what we don't want to do, the more we're going to respond in the right way, because we won't go off on our own human decisions, but we'll do something that's counterintuitive. See, Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he says, not my will, but your will be done. In other words, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to obey you. And this is why when this mob comes with swords, he says, I'm taking it. And he's so calm, cool, and collected that they're all starving. I want to encourage all of us this morning. When we're betrayed, to respond in the right way. I think sometimes we think of pain, we're going, avoid pain at any costs. But really, pain is going to happen into our lives. Suffering is going to come into our lives. But the way that we respond is going to be a blessing to us, to those around us. And so I want to encourage you guys this morning. See, what Jesus does is he heals Malchus's ear, and he looks forward to the resurrection in a few days, even after all the suffering. And what you have to understand is oftentimes, the moments and the times of difficulty and pain are right before the time of blessing and joy. If we continue faithfully pursuing after God. Lose the right to be right and rather choose to trust that God will make things right. And when we do that, there will be a victory. In some way, shape, or form, there will be a restoration. There will be God. Let's pray.